My name is Evelyn Dawson. I am 21 now, but I still remember in vivid detail the day my life began to split in two. The day my mother died, the day my father's shadow fell over every corner of my existence, the day the world told me I was on my own. I was 9 years old, and the sky had turned the color of iron that morning. A gray so heavy it pressed down on the earth and made every color look muted, lifeless, dead. We were at St. Bartholomew's Cemetery, a place I would never forget, a place that would always smell faintly of wet stone and pine. My mother lay in a mahogany coffin, her hands folded over her chest, her face pale but peaceful, as if she were finally sleeping. I didn't cry, not then. I didn't know how. I just held my grandfather Thomas Hartwell's hand and felt the rough, warm comfort of his palm around mine. "Little star," he whispered, and I could see the sorrow in his eyes. "I will always find you. Always." My father, Daniel Dawson, stood a few steps away. He was 6 feet tall, his coat buttoned tight, hands stuffed into his pockets. He didn't cry. He didn't move. He didn't look at us. He never had. I had grown up watching him hurt my mother, humiliate her, and charm other women into his orbit. Multiple affairs, each one another dagger in the fragile peace we pretended to have at home. He had a smile that could convince a room he was a saint, and a hand that could leave bruises no one else would see. And now, at her funeral, he was just Daniel, tall, silent, cold. We buried my mother under the gray sky. My grandfather stayed by my side, guiding me away from the digging earth, away from the whispers of strangers. "This is not your fault," he said. "It will never be." But the words felt hollow in a house where the walls themselves seemed to echo with cruelty. That afternoon, we moved. My father had bought a house on the other side of town, a bigger one, more expensive, but empty, cold, unwelcoming. "It's just us now," he said, as if that were enough. As if his words could erase my mother, erase the 12 years of her presence in our home, erase the love I would never feel again. I didn't understand the full weight of what he meant, but I believed him because I was 9 and I had nowhere else to go. The first night in the new house, I discovered something my grandfather had tried to warn me about. Daniel Dawson liked control. He didn't just control the household, he controlled the people in it. My mother's things were gone. Books, clothes, letters, even photographs. They were all packed away, some to storage, some likely thrown away. "We start fresh," he said, and I learned quickly that obedience was the currency of survival. 2 years later, when I was 11, the world got even colder. My father brought home Vanessa Hart, a woman whose smile was bright enough to blind you, whose laughter sounded like chimes in a warm summer wind. She had a daughter, Kelsey, 2 years older than me. Within a week, Kelsey moved into my bedroom. I was demoted to the basement. A cot, a lamp, a ceiling water stain shaped like a fist. I learned to navigate the darkness, to keep my voice low, to vanish into shadows. Kelsey was everything I was not. Confident, entitled, loud, my father adored her. He laughed at her jokes, smiled at her achievements, and ignored mine. I cooked, I cleaned. I did homework in the dim light of the basement, while the rest of the house echoed with parties, television shows, and Vanessa's constant chatter. Every attempt I made to speak, to ask for something, was shut down. "Drop it," my father said, as if my life, my needs, my existence were trivial. Birthdays and Christmases were the worst. My grandfather Thomas tried to reach me. Packages arrived at our old address, gifts, letters, little tokens of love meant to remind me I was not alone. My father intercepted them all. I would hear the delivery men knock, the rustle of envelopes, and then silence. The packages never reached me. I didn't understand why, but the hurt became familiar, like a shadow that followed me from room to room. By the time I was 13, I had perfected invisibility. I could walk through the house without being noticed, cook a meal without thanks, and clean a disaster my stepsister had made without a single word of acknowledgement. The basement became my sanctuary, my prison, and my home. I read, I wrote, I dreamed. I imagined a world where I was seen, where I was loved, where I didn't have to brace myself for every raised hand, every sharp word, every affair my father hid behind closed doors. School was my only escape. I threw myself into books, into learning, into anything that could make me feel capable and real. I was clever, quiet, observant. I could predict my father's moods, his temper, the exact moment he would lash out, the words that would make him smile. I learned to navigate his world so I could survive it. When I was 16, I discovered the full extent of my father's betrayals. He had spent years hiding documents, intercepting letters from my grandfather, controlling every piece of information I received. I found a box in the attic, old letters, certificates, gifts, letters my grandfather had sent, proofs of my mother's life, tokens of love, things my father had decided I didn't deserve. Rage bubbled in me, but it was silent. I couldn't confront him. I had to wait. I had to plan. By the time I was 18, I had learned to fight in ways my father would never see coming. I applied to nursing programs, earned scholarships, and started working 2 jobs. Kelsey dropped out of college. My father bailed her out without a second thought. I paid my own way, quietly, diligently, knowing that every dime I earned was a step toward freedom. Every day, I counted the months, the weeks, the hours until I could leave. I didn't know what awaited me, only that it had to be better than the life I had endured. Every night in the basement, I plotted in silence, reading my grandfather's letters over and over, memorizing the words that reminded me I was not invisible, I was not worthless, I was not broken beyond repair. The cage my father had built around me was solid. It had bars made of fear, walls made of control, locks forged from cruelty and neglect. But I had discovered something he could never understand. Intelligence, patience, and resilience are stronger than fists and arrogance, and I would find a way to open that cage, no matter how long it took. The snowstorm that would change everything had begun 12 years after my mother's death. December 24th, 11:14 p.m. I was standing barefoot in 6 inches of snow, the bitter cold biting into my skin, because I had asked my father a simple question: why didn't I get a present? Inside the house, 30 guests laughed. The Christmas tree blinked red and gold. My father poured his second glass of champagne. Vanessa sliced into a 3-layer cake. Kelsey waved at me from the window, a cruel mockery of acknowledgement, and then pulled the curtain shut. I thought that moment standing in the snow, ignored, invisible, was the worst moment of my life. I was wrong. Because from the darkness, a figure emerged. Tall, imposing, familiar. My grandfather, Thomas Hartwell. He wore a wool coat, his eyes bright despite the storm. And behind him, a black limousine rolled to a stop. In his hand, a folder of documents that my father had spent 12 years intercepting, hoarding, hiding. The cage had a key. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find out. The snow crunched beneath my bare feet as I followed my grandfather across the driveway. The night was sharp and brittle, the kind of cold that made your lungs ache and your fingers burn. I didn't ask where we were going. I didn't need to. I trusted Thomas Hartwell with a kind of faith I hadn't given anyone else since my mother died. He had been my anchor through 12 years of storms I wasn't supposed to survive. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low but urgent, "you've waited long enough." I blinked up at him. "What do you mean?" My teeth chattered, but not just from the cold. Something in his tone made my chest tighten with anticipation and fear. "Your father," he said, a shadow crossing his face. "He's been hiding truths from you your whole life. He's been cruel, controlling, reckless. But this ends tonight." I swallowed hard. I had rehearsed this confrontation 1,000 times in my mind, each scenario ending with some small victory, some form of justice. But none of them involved standing barefoot in the snow, staring at a limousine that I knew held the tools to unmask my father's lies. Inside the car, the warmth was immediate. The leather seats swallowed me. The heater wrapped around me like a protective cocoon. My grandfather handed me the folder, thick and heavy. I opened it carefully, almost afraid that the papers inside were fragile, sacred. Inside were documents I had never seen. Financial statements, letters my father had intercepted, proof of every affair, every hidden bank account, every manipulation meant to control not just me, but the people around him. "You need to understand," Thomas said. "This is everything. Every lie, every cruelty, every theft of your childhood. You have the right to claim what's yours, your future, your money, your dignity." I held the folder against my chest, feeling the weight of my life compressed into papers and ink. I didn't cry, not yet. The anger came first, hot and raw. My father had stolen my childhood, my mother, my safety, and for what? To feed his ego, to satisfy his endless hunger for control. "You're ready for this," my grandfather continued, his hand firm on my shoulder, "but you have to be smart. He's dangerous, not just physically. He'll try to manipulate you, intimidate you, charm you. You can't let him see that you're afraid or that you care." I nodded, even though my stomach was twisting with nerves. I had spent 12 years learning invisibility. Now it was time to step into the light. The next morning I returned home, folder in hand, every nerve on alert. The house smelled of cinnamon and pine from the Christmas decorations Vanessa had insisted on keeping up, despite my protests last year. Kelsey was sprawled across the couch, scrolling through her phone, completely oblivious to the storm I carried with me. My father emerged from the kitchen, his morning coffee in hand. His eyes narrowed when he saw me. "Where have you been?" he asked, voice deceptively calm. I held his gaze. "Out, walking." He laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "Walking in the snow? At this hour? You'll catch your death." I didn't flinch. I can handle myself. He frowned, clearly unsettled by the defiance. "Is this because of the letters I found in the attic?" "You've been snooping." I pulled the folder from my bag and dropped it on the table. Papers fanned out, catching the sunlight streaming through the windows. "I've been reading. I've been seeing." He looked at the documents, his expression shifting from annoyance to disbelief. "Where did you get these?" "My grandfather gave them to me," I said. "Everything you tried to hide. Everything you thought I'd never see." The tension in the room was palpable. Vanessa appeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray of coffee and pastries. She stopped when she saw the folder. "Evelyn," she said, her voice sharp. "What is that?" "I think it's called The Truth," I said. Kelsey snorted, leaning back on the couch. "Oh, here we go. The basement ghost thinks she's finally going to ruin our Christmas." I ignored her. This wasn't about Christmas. It wasn't about her. It wasn't about Vanessa. This was about survival. About reclaiming the years that had been stolen from me. My father slammed his hand on the table, making the papers jump. "You have no idea what you're doing," he growled. "These documents don't mean anything. You'll ruin yourself if you—" "I know exactly what I'm doing," I interrupted. "I've spent 12 years learning your games. I've spent 12 years being invisible, being ignored, being silenced. Not anymore." The house seemed to hold its breath. Vanessa clutched her coffee cup as if it were a shield. Kelsey rolled her eyes but didn't speak. And for the first time in my life, I felt something I hadn't felt since my mother's death. Power. "You're making a mistake," my father said finally, his voice low, dangerous. "Do you know what happens when you challenge me?" "I do," I said, "and I'm ready." The confrontation didn't end in violence, not yet, but the message was clear. My father had underestimated me. He thought I would cower. He thought I would crumble. But I had spent years preparing for this moment. And I had allies. My grandfather, my own resolve, and a life outside this house that I was determined to reclaim. Over the next few weeks, I began taking concrete steps. I opened a separate bank account using documents from my grandfather, started applying for apartments, and enrolled in night classes that would give me the financial independence I needed. Each step was small, deliberate, calculated to avoid immediate retaliation. I knew my father's patience had limits, and when he snapped, it would be brutal. Vanessa tried to intervene, trying to guilt me, manipulate me with her smiles and insinuations. Kelsey attempted passive-aggressive sabotage, hiding my things, spreading rumors at school. But I had learned how to fight without throwing punches, how to win without alerting the opponent to my strategy. The real turning point came one evening, when my father returned home later than usual. I was in the living room, folder open, reviewing financial papers, when I heard the key in the lock. "Evelyn," he said, voice cold, "we need to talk." I didn't look up. I didn't flinch. "About what?" "About your future." I closed the folder and stood, letting the weight of my presence fill the room. "My future is mine." He studied me for a long moment, the first real hesitation I had seen in years. Then he smiled, a smile without warmth. "You're growing up fast, aren't you? But you're still a child in my house." "Not for long," I said, and walked past him to the door. That night, I packed my essentials. A suitcase with clothes, my journals, a few books, and the folder that represented years of stolen truth. My grandfather was waiting in the car. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I am," I said. And for the first time in years, I felt the excitement of freedom, sharp, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. We drove through the quiet streets, snow falling in thick sheets, each flake a promise of a new life. I knew the fight wasn't over. My father would retaliate. Vanessa and Kelsey would do their worst. But I had discovered something that could not be taken from me: resilience. And that night I vowed, no matter the obstacles, I would claim the life that had been denied to me. The first real step toward independence was taken. The folder rested in my lap, heavy with the weight of truth and possibility. My grandfather reached over and squeezed my hand. "This is just the beginning," he said. And he was right. The beginning of freedom always comes with a storm. But I had learned to survive storms. I had no intention of letting this one break me. That night, as the snow fell and the city slept beneath a blanket of white, I realized something crucial. The cage my father had built around me for 12 years was not impenetrable. It was flawed, and I had found the key. The question now was simple. Would I use it wisely, or would my father see my every move and strike before I could claim my independence? The first morning in my own apartment felt surreal. The air smelled faintly of detergent and old paper, a mix of sterility and history, and the radiator hummed a low, comforting song. I sat on the edge of the bed, the folder still clutched to my chest, like a talisman against the chaos I knew was coming. Leaving my father's house was only the beginning. The real battle had just begun. I hadn't been gone more than a few hours when the first message arrived. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Do you really think you can escape? You're nothing without me." My stomach twisted. The number was masked, but the tone was unmistakably his. Controlling, venomous, designed to intimidate. I took a deep breath, forcing my hand to stop trembling. Fear had been a constant companion for 12 years, but it no longer had a home in me. I typed a single word and hit send. "I'm not afraid." The reply was almost immediate. "You will be." I dropped the phone and leaned back against the wall. I had expected retaliation, but the venom in his words made my skin crawl. My grandfather's warnings echoed in my mind. He'll try to manipulate, charm, intimidate. Don't let him see fear. The first few weeks were a delicate dance of vigilance and preparation. I changed my phone number, installed locks, and refused to respond to any calls from unknown numbers. My grandfather helped me set up a legal framework to protect myself financially and legally, but even with precautions, the emotional warfare began in earnest. One evening, there was a knock at my door. I peered through the peephole. It was Vanessa. "I just wanted to talk," she said, a saccharine smile pasted across her face. I didn't invite her in. "Why? To tell me how terrible I am? To prove how much control your father still has over me?" Her smile faltered. "Evelyn, I don't mean." "Leave," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She hesitated, then backed away. I locked the door and sank to the floor, chest heaving. Even without my father present, his influence reached into my sanctuary. Through Vanessa, through fear. It was then that I realized the fight wouldn't just be legal or financial. It would be psychological. He wanted to control every aspect of my life, even when I wasn't near him. And the thought of his manipulations making me doubt myself, even for a second, made my blood boil. The next morning brought more revelations. My grandfather arrived with a thick envelope, stamped and official. "These were in your father's files," he said, handing it over. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, documenting everything, his affairs, bribes, and schemes, some involving people I didn't even know. The evidence was damning. I felt a mix of disgust and vindication. The man who had controlled my life, who had beaten my mother, who had tried to manipulate everyone around him, was not invincible. But the deeper I looked, the darker the story became. Among the documents were letters and contracts suggesting that my mother's death was not entirely natural. There were discrepancies in her medical records, notes from doctors that had been altered, and insurance policies that seemed suspiciously timed. My father had not just been cruel, he had been meticulous in hiding evidence, in covering tracks, in making sure no one could question him. I sank into my chair, hands shaking. The realization hit me like a freight train. Everything I had believed about my family, my childhood, and my mother's death had been carefully constructed lies. I felt the weight of 12 years pressing down, but also an unfamiliar spark of resolve. If he thought he could intimidate me into submission, he was wrong. The retaliation escalated quickly. Anonymous letters arrived at my apartment, each more threatening than the last. My father had discovered my new address despite every precaution. I began to fear for my physical safety. My grandfather insisted on installing security cameras and alarms, but even with these measures, sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. One night, around midnight, there was a pounding at the door. My heart leapt into my throat. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the intruder had vanished. The only thing left was a note scrawled in my father's handwriting. "You cannot run from me, Evelyn. I will always find you. And when I do, you will regret it." I read the note over and over, tears welling in my eyes. Not because I was afraid, but because I realized how deeply he had shaped my life. For 12 years, he had been the axis around which my world spun. And now, I was learning to rotate on my own, without him. Amid this chaos, secrets continued to surface. My grandfather revealed that my father had not only abused my mother, but had manipulated my entire extended family, Siblings, cousins, even my mother's closest friends had been kept at arm's length, manipulated into believing his version of reality. And the worst part, my father had done this to me too. "You've been living in his shadow," my grandfather said one night, sitting across from me in the small kitchen. Every decision, every fear, every insecurity, he orchestrated it. But shadows disappear when the light shines. I nodded, trying to absorb his words. It was comforting and terrifying all at once. I had spent my life navigating a minefield without knowing it, and now I had the map, but the mines were still there. The psychological attacks continued. Vanessa tried to convince neighbors that I was unstable. Kelsey spread rumors at school, and my father used his charm to create allies in unexpected places. I realized that leaving the house hadn't freed me from him. It had simply moved the battlefield. And yet I discovered resilience in myself I hadn't known existed. Every letter, every rumor, every threat was met with careful strategy. I documented everything, kept logs, and built an evidence trail that would protect me in court if needed. I learned to anticipate their moves, to understand their patterns, and to stay 2 steps ahead. One day I received a phone call from an unknown number. My father's voice was smooth, deceptively calm. "Evelyn, it's time we talked. You don't understand the consequences of your actions. I can make things very difficult for you." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I understand perfectly, and I'm ready." "You think you're ready," he said, the venom in his tone barely hidden. "But you don't know what I'm capable of." "I know exactly what you're capable of," I said, "and it doesn't scare me anymore." There was a long silence on the line, then the click of the call ending. For the first time, I realized something vital. The man who had loomed so large over my life for 12 years could no longer control me. I had acknowledged the truth, armed myself with evidence, and built a support system that he couldn't manipulate. But the real test was still ahead. My father had underestimated me. And in that underestimation lay his greatest vulnerability. The more desperate he became, the more mistakes he would make, and I intended to use every one of them. As the weeks passed, I began to see cracks in the carefully constructed facade of my father's life. Secret accounts, hidden relationships, and layers of deceit began to unravel under scrutiny, and with each revelation, my confidence grew. I was no longer the frightened, invisible girl he had sought to control. I was a force he could not predict, a storm he could not contain. Yet, with every victory, there was a cost. Sleepless nights, paranoia, and the ever-present fear for my safety took their toll. I missed the ordinary, small moments of teenage life that had been stolen from me. Friends, parties, laughter, everything normal had been denied. And now, even as I reclaimed my independence, I mourned the years lost to fear, lies, and control. But one night, as I sat reviewing documents in my small apartment, I realized something crucial. I was no longer living in the past. I was no longer defined by his cruelty. Every document, every secret uncovered, every threat resisted was a step toward reclaiming my life. The storm around me was fierce, but I had learned to navigate it. I had become the captain of my own ship. And I knew, with unwavering certainty, that the final confrontation was inevitable. My father would strike harder than ever to reassert control. But this time, I was ready. This time I had the truth, the law, and my own resilience on my side, and I would not be broken. The shadows of my father's manipulation still loomed, but I had found the light, and in that light I discovered not just survival, but power. The power to reclaim everything he had tried to steal. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and paper, a sterile, almost oppressive scent that reminded me of my father's office. Except here, I wasn't the one being interrogated. I stood at the edge of the crowded room, hands clenched around the strap of my bag, as my lawyer guided me through the procedures I had memorized for weeks. Every step was deliberate, every detail rehearsed. I had learned to anticipate his moves, but anticipation did not erase the flutter of nerves in my stomach. The hearing was set to address the guardianship disputes over my mother's estate and the legal protection of the assets my father had long manipulated. I was prepared not just with documents, but with every photograph, contract, and ledger I had uncovered, each one a thread pulling at the tapestry of his carefully constructed lies. And then he appeared, my father. His presence alone seemed to warp the space around him. Even without raising his voice, he commanded attention. People turned, eyes widening, but I didn't flinch. I had spent a lifetime under his shadow, and I had emerged determined to face him on my own terms. He smiled when he saw me, a predatory curl that made my skin crawl. Evelyn, he said, voice smooth, like silk over steel. I see you've been busy. I have, I replied, calm and steady. I'm here to ensure justice for my mother and for myself. The lawyer spoke first, laying out the evidence meticulously. Each document, each photograph, each financial irregularity was presented with clarity, leaving little room for denial. My father's initial composure wavered slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his features before he masked it with a smirk. He attempted the first wave of manipulation, charm. Turning to the judge, he spoke of his role as a provider, a patriarch, a man who had sacrificed everything for the family. He painted my mother as difficult, as unstable, subtly implying that I had been influenced by external forces. But the documents were undeniable. The layers of deceit, the hidden accounts, the manipulation of family members, they could not be explained away with charm. I felt a quiet satisfaction as the judge studied the evidence. I realized then that this was not just a legal battle, it was a psychological one. My father had always relied on perception and intimidation. Here, under the sterile light of the courtroom, perception was powerless without truth. Outside the courthouse, the world seemed impossibly bright. Reporters whispered in the hallways, snapping photos, and my grandfather stayed close, a steady anchor in a storm I had long endured alone. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of support around me, not just from family, but from the law itself, an invisible but formidable ally. Despite the courtroom victories, the emotional toll was relentless. My father's influence had seeped into the very fabric of my psyche, and I often found myself replaying old memories with fresh eyes. The sound of his voice, the sight of his smug expressions, even the faint scent of his cologne, everything triggered flashes of fear I had thought buried. Therapy helped, but progress was uneven. Emotional scars did not heal with evidence. They healed with time, confrontation, and acknowledgement. One evening, weeks into the legal proceedings, a call came that shook me. It was my father. "Evelyn," he said, voice tight. "I know what you're doing. You think you're winning, but you're tearing the family apart." I gritted my teeth. "I'm not tearing anything apart. I'm uncovering the truth." "You think truth matters?" he sneered. "Truth is what I say it is. You can fight me in court, but outside those walls, I still control the narrative. Everyone still listens to me." I remained silent, letting his words hang in the air. I had anticipated this argument. It was the same old tactic: intimidation, fear, manipulation. But I had grown stronger. I had learned to recognize it, to name it, and to refuse it power. "I control my own life now," I said finally, "and no one, not you, not anyone else, can take that away from me." The line went silent. I imagined the tightening of his jaw, the storm brewing behind his eyes. For the first time, I sensed genuine frustration, a crack in the armor of his self-assuredness. Weeks passed, and the court sessions intensified. Witnesses came forward, family members, neighbors, even former employees, each one corroborating pieces of the story I had pieced together. My father's charm failed to sway them. Lies faltered under scrutiny. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the control he had wielded for decades began to fracture. But it wasn't just legal victories that defined this phase of the battle. My father attempted subtler attacks. Rumors spread through family circles, whispers in social gatherings, attempts to isolate me emotionally from those I trusted. Vanessa, once a weapon in his arsenal, began showing hesitation. Perhaps she sensed the shift, or perhaps she simply feared being caught in the crossfire. Either way, she started making mistakes, sharing information carelessly, contradicting herself, exposing the cracks in his influence. I documented everything. Each lie, each act of intimidation, each manipulation was recorded, filed, and categorized. The meticulousness that had once defined my father's control now became my weapon against him. I realized that in every system of manipulation, there is a weakness, the smallest inconsistency, the slightest contradiction, and I was learning to exploit them. One afternoon, a breakthrough came. An accountant, previously loyal to my father, agreed to testify about hidden accounts and illicit transfers. It was a turning point. The evidence was irrefutable, detailed, and damning. I watched as my father's expression shifted from confidence to anger, then to disbelief. For the first time, the mask of omnipotence slipped. Outside the courthouse, I allowed myself a rare moment of relief. My grandfather hugged me tightly. "You're doing more than surviving," he said. "You're winning." "I'm not done yet," I replied, resolute. "This is only the beginning. The final reckoning is still ahead." Even with victories mounting, the personal toll remained. My sleep was fragmented, anxiety a constant companion, memories of my mother's suffering, the years of abuse, and the betrayals of my father's manipulation haunted me. There were nights when I questioned whether justice could ever truly erase the pain, whether legal victories could repair the invisible fractures in my psyche. And yet, amidst the struggle, I discovered a resilience I hadn't known existed. Every confrontation, every court session, every documented truth reinforced a simple but powerful realization. I was no longer a passive participant in my story. I was the author. The pages of my life were mine to write, and no amount of intimidation or control could erase that. Then came the day of the final hearing. The courtroom was tense, every seat filled, every eye on the drama that had unfolded over months. My father entered, impeccably dressed, exuding the charisma he had relied on for years. But there was something different in his demeanor, an undercurrent of tension, a recognition that the battle was no longer in his favor. Witnesses testified, documents were scrutinized, and arguments were made with precision. My father attempted to sway the proceedings with charm and manipulation, but the meticulous preparation, the corroborated evidence, and the undeniable truth rendered his efforts futile. For the first time, I saw the cracks widen, the control he had exerted for so long unraveling under the weight of accountability. As the judge delivered the ruling, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. Justice, measured and deliberate, had been served. My father's manipulations, his abuse, his deceit, all were exposed and addressed. I felt a surge of empowerment, tempered by the knowledge that healing would be a lifelong process. Leaving the courthouse, I realized the fight had not been just against him. It had been against every fear, every doubt, every piece of myself that had been shaped by years of abuse. And in facing him, in confronting the truth, I had reclaimed not just my mother's legacy, but my own identity. For the first time in years, I felt the possibility of peace. Not a naive peace, free from challenges or scars, but a deliberate, earned peace. A life defined by my choices, my strength, and my resilience. The weeks following the court ruling were strangely quiet. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet that comes after a storm. A tension that hints at the calm, yet promises change. My father retreated, visibly restrained, no longer the omnipotent force he had once been. Yet I knew better than to believe that silence equaled surrender. He had survived scrutiny before, though never with such exposure, never with so many witnesses to his manipulation, his cruelty, and his infidelities. I spent those weeks reflecting on what had transpired. Every court session, every confrontation, every lie he had attempted to weave unraveled in my hands. And yet there remained a shadow, a residue of fear that lingered in the corners of my mind. Even as justice had been served, I felt the echo of years of abuse reverberating within me. Healing, I realized, would not be an immediate reward, it would be a deliberate, continuous act. My mother, liberated from her husband's control in both practical and legal ways, began to emerge from her shell of fear. Watching her rediscover her own voice, her own agency, was a revelation. She laughed more freely, spoke with conviction, and even began small projects she had long deferred. It struck me that her strength had always existed. It had been suppressed, buried beneath years of intimidation and psychological manipulation. The court had given her protection, but life beyond the courthouse was granting her freedom. I, too, began to reclaim parts of myself that had been dormant. Small acts at first, deciding what to eat without second-guessing, driving alone, attending social events without anxiety, speaking my mind in conversations I once would have avoided. Each action felt monumental, as though every small choice was a declaration of independence. I discovered that autonomy was not a single achievement. It was a series of choices, each one a brick in the foundation of a life rebuilt. Yet my father's presence lingered like a shadow. Though stripped of legal control, he attempted subtle manipulations, emails with veiled threats, calls in the dead of night, and whispered rumors in social circles. I did not respond in anger or fear. Instead, I cataloged, documented, and strategically countered. Every attempt at intimidation became evidence of continued malice, a pattern that further exposed his character to those around him. It was during one of these late-night confrontations that I realized the true nature of liberation. It was not just the absence of control, but the presence of clarity. I no longer had to navigate his moods, anticipate his lies, or absorb his manipulations. Each encounter was no longer a battle, but a confirmation of boundaries I had learned to enforce. I understood now that freedom was as much an internal state as it was an external reality. As the months passed, my father's attempts grew less frequent, less effective. Friends who had once been swayed by his charisma began to see the cracks, the inconsistencies, the undeniable evidence of his actions. Vanessa, who had once danced on the edge of loyalty to him, now approached me cautiously, offering information that would have been unthinkable months before. Slowly, the network of influence he had relied upon for decades unraveled. One afternoon, a revelation arrived that was almost symbolic, a letter from one of my father's long-term associates, confessing knowledge of financial misdeeds, emotional manipulation, and deliberate attempts to isolate my mother and me. It was a final thread tying together years of deceit into a single narrative. Holding the letter in my hands, I felt the weight of truth settle like a tangible object. The final pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. I arranged a family meeting, not in the cold confines of a courtroom, but in the warmth of my mother's living room. My grandfather, supportive and steady, sat beside her. I invited other family members who had witnessed, suffered, or been affected by my father's actions. There was tension, yes, but also anticipation. The anticipation of closure, of acknowledgement, and of truth, finally spoken aloud. We confronted him together, calmly, methodically. Every allegation, every documented act, every corroborated memory was presented. There was no spectacle, no theatrics, just undeniable truth. My father attempted to deflect, to charm, to twist narratives, but the collective weight of evidence and testimony was immovable. For the first time in decades, he could not manipulate the narrative. He could not intimidate or charm his way out. In that room, a long-buried sense of justice unfolded. My mother spoke with a confidence I had not heard before. Her voice steady, unwavering, reclaiming the dignity that had been stripped from her. I spoke too, articulating the pain, the struggles, and the triumphs we had endured. And my grandfather, witness to both the suffering and the perseverance, offered perspective, grounding the confrontation in a history that was larger than any single act of cruelty. The liberation that followed was profound. My father, once the axis around which fear and manipulation revolved, was reduced to a figure whose influence had limits, whose control was broken. The psychological dominance he had wielded for decades was no longer viable, and as his power waned, I recognized the vast expanse of possibilities that lay before me. Possibilities defined not by fear or submission, but by agency, courage, and resilience. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding, not just materially, but emotionally and psychologically. Therapy became not just a tool for coping, but a method for growth. I learned to identify triggers, to understand the mechanisms of abuse, and to cultivate habits that reinforced autonomy and self-worth. I began writing, documenting my journey, not only as a personal catharsis, but as a testament to survival, a guide for others navigating similar labyrinths of manipulation and trauma. Friendships deepened, built on mutual respect and honesty rather than obligation or fear. Social interactions no longer carried the subtle anxiety of potential entrapment or judgment. I discovered that relationships, when untainted by manipulation, could be sources of genuine support, encouragement, and growth. One evening, reflecting on the journey, I realized the enormity of the transformation. The girl who had once flinched at her father's shadow, who had internalized years of abuse, who had lived in a world defined by manipulation and fear, had become a woman capable of confronting truth, enforcing boundaries, and reclaiming her life. Liberation was no longer abstract. It was embodied, tangible, and lived every day. Even as I embraced this new life, I recognized that vigilance was necessary. Trauma does not vanish, it adapts, leaving echoes that require ongoing attention. Yet, armed with awareness, courage, and the knowledge of my own strength, I faced each challenge with confidence rather than fear. The lessons of survival, once bitter and suffocating, had become tools for empowerment. Ultimately, the journey revealed a profound truth. Liberation is both an end and a beginning. It is the closure of one chapter defined by exposure, confrontation, and accountability. And it is the opening of another, rich with possibility, defined by choice, autonomy, and the reclamation of self. In the quiet moments when the world feels still, I feel the full weight of what has been achieved. My mother, my grandfather, and I exist in a space once denied to us, a space defined by honesty, respect, and the absence of fear. My father's presence, once all-consuming, has been diminished, and with it, the shadow of manipulation no longer looms over our lives. I continue to document, to reflect, and to build. Each day is an affirmation of autonomy, each decision a declaration of strength. And though the scars of the past remain, they are no longer chains. They are reminders of resilience, markers of the journey from oppression to empowerment. The story, once defined by fear and manipulation, now unfolds on terms of truth and courage. And in that, I have discovered the most profound form of liberation, the freedom to live authentically, to choose my path, and to embrace the future, unbound by the shadows of the past. Subscribe for more heart-touching and relatable stories.